Jennifer is joining us to give a presentation on work that she's been doing as a research fellow for IDDP. And Jennifer, I'll allow you to say as much or as little by way of introducing yourself as you'd like to, because I'm really anxious just to really hear about the work itself.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate having this opportunity. So thank you so much for inviting me. So I guess just by way of introduction, I am currently at the Loyola University Chicago in the Department of Political Science. And so I have spent a long time as a political theorist thinking about the relationship between democracy and technology, and the ways that technologies are introducing new kinds of sort of interpersonal relationships, habits, behaviors, and so on. And so I am very grateful for IDTV's support for this new project. I'm really excited to share this with you. It's very early work, and so I'm happy to hear any and all comments. I will just say very quickly up at the front here that there's sort of a content warning that I feel necessary to give. So the talk today is about incels, which are nowadays a radically and aggressively misogynistic hate group, frankly. And so unfortunately, studying them means engaging with that rhetoric. And so what I will be sharing today is some posts that many people will likely find upsetting because they're decent people. But that's the data I'm working with, so that's why I'm sharing it. With that happy thought in mind, though, I guess let's just jump in and talk about it. So it seems uncontroversial at this point that digital technologies like the internet and especially social media are giving rise to all kinds of extremist groups. So we see them gathering on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Parler, Gab, Truth Social, a bunch of other ones I can't even keep up with anymore. But these groups are actively undermining democracy by doing things like radicalizing users, cultivating conspiracy theories, coordinating harassment against all kinds of people, and in the extreme, fomenting insurrection. And I think it's undeniable that this is all true. Digital technologies do aid and are used to aid extremist groups. But I think that it's simply too early to write these technologies off entirely. They might host Nazis and other hate groups, but these are also sites where historically marginalized groups gather to amplify messages of inclusion and facilitate pro-democracy protests on an unprecedented scale. So these technologies are, in other words, reinvigorating the public sphere in really exciting ways and also really troubling ways. They are facilitating the formation of new publics that makes walking away from these technologies simply impossible. And so instead, I would propose that the question we're left with is, how can we ensure that the groups that are using or facilitated by the internet are democratic ones? I am not the first to pose this question. And so in answering this question, many scholars and practitioners, myself included, have pointed to things like figuring out certain design elements. So looking at like anonymity or the sort of ways that platforms structure user behaviors, and whether those help to facilitate or undermine the formation of a democratic group identity. And so here again, the idea is with certain technological affordances, we can help users behave in kind of pro-democratic ways. Alternatively, there are other people who highlight the success of more stringent kind of corporate policies, banning things like hate speech or extremist groups from organizing on the platforms. And the idea is to prevent anti-democratic sentiments from spreading on platforms in the first place, right? So this is a kind of, if you ban it, they won't come kind of mentality. What both of these sort of approaches have in common is that they focus on top-down interventions. So these are interventions by corporations or the kind of developers within those corporations that are intended to shape user behavior in ways that facilitate the formation of democratic social groups and users and to thwart undemocratic ones. So in this project, though, I'm taking an alternative approach, though I think it's a complementary one. So I'm not saying that these first two are ones to get rid of, but that we maybe have something else to think about as well. So using the case of incels, I'm going to show how group identities are also shaped by bottom-up user-directed practices that also have profound effects on the formation of democratic or anti-democratic communities online, even within the constraints of platform design or corporate governance policies. So for the rest, here's just a kind of sketch and outline. After first explaining a bit about who incels are, for those that may not be familiar, as well as how the group has transformed over time, I'll spend the majority of my time today outlining the ways that this identity of way of being incel was constructed in two early incel communities, one called Incel Support and the other called Love Shy. Both of these forums shared basic platform affordances, including anonymity. I'll show that Incel Support nevertheless cultivated a more democratic incel identity by establishing strong norms of anti-misogyny, plurality, and contestation, which were reflected in the group's moderation practices. On Love Shy, by contrast, the community developed an anti-democratic incel identity that was characterized by aggressive misogyny and violent rhetoric, and that was supported by an authoritarian moderation strategy as well. And I think by highlighting the role of group norms and the moderation practices that help set and enforce those norms, I argue that we can develop not only a more nuanced account of the processes through which the experience of involuntary celibacy transformed into a variety of incel identities, but also develop additional strategies for potentially re-democratizing those identities today. And so I will conclude with some thoughts on what we might do with this work. Okay, so incels today have a bad reputation, and pretty deservedly so. For the past decade, incels have gained notoriety for their aggressive, often violent misogyny, culminating oftentimes in high-profile attacks in physical spaces, so things including mass shootings, stabbings, and vehicle rammings. But while the language of incel has only recently entered into the public sphere, the term and the set of experiences it represents has a much longer history. So incels are those who deviate from dominant social norms and expectations around sex and sexuality by way of sort of desiring to have sex, but for whatever reason, not being able to find a willing partner to do so. People who are incels have been studied by a few psychologists over the years, and they found that due to this experience, incels often have a sense of being off time. They feel sort of out of sync with the rest of the adult population. And this has significant repercussions for their self-perception, so that incels often feel despair, depression, frustration, and a loss of confidence, as well as a sense of social marginalization and stigma. And while for much of their existence, as you can imagine, incels were notoriously difficult to locate, due largely to the intensely personal nature of their predicament, the advent of the internet and its promise of anonymity has afforded incels new spaces where they're gathering to not only commiserate, but also to build solidarity and a sense of community with one another. And so this Burgess article from a decade ago is super interesting because it's talking about how it's much easier to study these communities now with the internet. But the first documented of these sort of incel spaces online was something called Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project. This was started by Alana, who was a 24-year-old queer woman living in Toronto at the time. And the project was modeled after queer support networks and was intended to be a gathering place for members to share their thoughts, experiences, and resources relating to involuntary celibacy. So this is the landing page of the project on the screen because it's early 2000s. That's just what the internet looked like back then. Obviously, things have changed pretty dramatically. So what's on the screen now are some images from the subreddit, the Red Pill, which is an incel adjacent subreddit. It's the only one left really on Reddit. Reddit has banned the rest of these groups from gathering. But what I'm arguing in this project is that the process of transformation is instructive, I think, that looking at how incels went from Alana's group as this kind of supportive self-fashioning to this process of murdering women with seeming abandon can give us some insight into what kinds of patterns we should be looking for in order to prevent this kind of radicalization in the future and also potentially reverse what's happened already. So tracing a decade of transformation is, of course, a huge undertaking, and I've just started. So what I'm going to talk about today is one very small slice of that. But again, I think it's one that's instructive for all sorts of reasons. So I'll be looking at two competing boards that existed together in the early 2000s. So the first is called Incel Support. Its dates are up on the slide. And the second is called Love Shy. There's some terminology difference between these two that I'm happy to talk more about if you all are interested in. But it sort of gets in the weeds, so I won't for now. So these sites are very similar in terms of technological affordances. Both of them were anonymous forums populated by users with persistent pseudonyms. But what I want to argue is that they cultivated oppositional incel identities through the distinct choices and behaviors on the part of their group members and moderators alike. The result was that Incel Support cultivated a democratic identity, while Love Shy became openly anti-democratic. So I want to start with Incel Support. Incel Support was the spiritual successor to Alana's original mailing list. Within this forum, the community cultivated a self-understanding of incel as, in the words of a former member, not a permanent thing, but rather a temporary condition to be overcome. So you could have joined the group so that you could talk to other people about how to not be incel anymore. There was a degree of internal contestation over this identity, however, and this was really grounded in the shared commitment that the community had to embracing multiple ways of being incel. So incel supports members included both gay and straight people. It also included women. It included people who had at one point had sex but were not anymore. It also included people who are in sexless marriages, all of which or whom are no longer sort of allowed to be incel in incel spaces that exist today. The result was that incel support was marked by a distinctively feminist identity, or at least that's sort of how it was identified within the incelosphere as a feminist space. But more importantly, I think for our purposes, it was a space that insisted on norms and moderation practices that made the community more open and welcoming to outsiders. And so my argument is that incel support reflected a more democratic incel identity in both process and outcome. Incel was understood to be constructed through the active collaboration of an internal contestation between the board's many members. It not only reflected this plurality as a result, but it also retained its connections to the wider society it was a part of, right? So the goal of joining this group was to ultimately leave it and sort of enter back into wider society. And we can see this kind of more pluralistic, anti-misogynistic, more democratic identity in old forum posts. So many posts on incel support focused on the condition of being incel. New members, again, both men and women, introduced themselves in these terms, and threads included speculation on the causes of incel, the discussion of various fixes to the problem, as well as exchanging of support and advice between members on topics both incel related and not. So it's just a pretty standard internet forum. But this isn't to say that there was no hint of misogyny that would later become synonymous with incels. So in one 2013 post, a new member joins the community. Sorry, I can't see this all. A new member introduces himself to the board by saying, in part, I'm an introvert. Women like aggressive alpha males, despite what everyone says, I'm no good at playing the part. And so here we can see the kind of hostility towards women, as well as rhetoric around alpha males that are kind of hallmarks of incel ideology today. And yet perhaps unexpectedly, that rhetoric was met with immediate reproach by existing incel support members. Okay, so the first response to that original poster starts with "Hi, welcome," kind of. It immediately then begins admonishing the new user to please do some reading around here, read the frequently asked questions, read our dead horse topics, read the threads where people have talked about the issues that you bring up. This member then goes on to recap the original poster's argument as, quote, not knowing anything about women or assuming the worst of them, before they then plea for the new member to learn about women. And if you're just assuming that women are materialistic, shallow bitches whose knees go weak at the sight of an alpha male, stop assuming that. So instead of agreeing with the new member's assessment of women, or even just ignoring his casual misogyny, this incel support member explicitly counters the new poster's assumptions. They also introduced the original poster to the board's norms, suggesting that such rhetoric is inappropriate for the community and directing him to resources where he could learn more about it. This response is not unique. So other members of incel support responded to the thread, first seconding everything the first member said, offering other suggestions like take a look at some of the rules and topics that are best left not discussed before you proceed to participate, and warning that many of your thoughts about what has kept you in incel are not only harmful for yourself, but they are tiring and harmful for others to hear as well. So in these posts, and again, sorry, just a note, so I've blacked out, this is following kind of best practices for internet research and extremist research, but I blacked out the usernames as best I could. So I promise that's all I blacked out. But here in these posts, we can see, again, incel support members actively and consciously countering the kind of casual misogyny that, again, really runs rampant in incel communities today. So rather than accept it or even allow it to pass without mention, this example illustrates that incel support members were engaged in collectively responding to misogyny in a way that simultaneously worked to correct the original poster by identifying the ways that he violated the community's norms, but also, I think, reify the identity of the incel support community as a feminist space that wouldn't tolerate this kind of behavior. And these kind of responses were common in the community, indicating, I think, a strong norm of anti-misogyny among incels on the site. Moreover, the community norms that helped to cement incels support's democratic identity weren't just spontaneously developed, they were also intentionally reinforced through moderation practices. So moderation on incel support was undertaken by a group of people. Again, that's pretty standard for many internet forums. It usually involved 2 to 4 people at any given time. However, as this one thread from 2008 reveals, the incel support community explicitly and intentionally tried to ensure that at least one of these moderators was always a woman. In addition, another thread, this one, indicates the logistics, like who would moderate and how, were the subject of discussion threads that anyone could join. So this thread talks about sort of how many should we have and like how should we make sure that it's equitably distributed. So reading these threads, I think, also makes it clear that there was disagreement among the community in terms of like what kind of space it should be and how it should be moderated. So in this 2009 thread, one member notes that they've noticed that there's much more negativity on the board lately. Maybe it has to do with Valentine's Day or something, but it's definitely affecting all parts of the board. And another poster responds to this observation by arguing that there's a blatant attempt by some to make people shut the fuck up that are not saying something that's beneficial to everyone in a positive manner. And so it doesn't feel much like a support community for everyone lately, in my opinion. And so again, the rest of the thread sort of goes back and forth about this and what's possible and what's desirable. But here again, we see the members of this community discussing and disagreeing about the direction that it should take, expressing concern over its shift in identity and the practices through which that identity is maintained, as well as talking about what's left out from these practices and norms. And so from these examples, we can begin to see how incel support developed a reputation as a feminist space. This democratic identity was the result of deliberate anti-misogynistic norm setting by the community members themselves. And it was reflected in moderation practices that were representative, transparent, and contested by other members. The result, as one former member recalls, was that while there was still negativity on the board, fatalistic and defeatist attitudes, as well as misogyny and anti-feminism, were not as problematic as it is now. And again, I want to emphasize that I don't think that this identity can be fully understood or explained by looking solely at the technological affordances involved, like anonymity or the design of the board space. I actually think it illustrates the ways that the meaning of incel was the product of deliberate choices on the part of the community members regarding the kind of identity and community that they wanted to be part of. So I guess I will stop here and just ask, are there any questions before I move on to talking about Love Shy? Okay, so we can contrast the norms and moderation practices of incel support with a quote unquote rival incel community, which was called loveshy.com, shortened to Loveshy. Formed in 2003, the Loveshy forum served for many years as a landing pad for those members who were initially banned from incel support for violating those strong norms of anti-misogyny and inclusion. But while Loveshy too cultivated a collective incel identity, it differed from incel support by being explicitly misogynistic. And again, this was no coincidence. The difference in identity accompanied a difference in community norms and moderation practices that I argue helped facilitate a more radically anti-democratic, more violent, more misogynist, less diverse, less contested community. In many ways, however, the two boards were quite similar. So like incel support, the Loveshy Talk forum was full of like pretty benign threads in which members simply like exchanged suggestions on things like weight loss or opinions on news stories or support for personal experiences that had nothing to do with dating or relationships. But these threads also revealed that the community norms differed from incel support and how those differences were deliberately encouraged both by board members and moderators. So again, we'll go through some examples. This is really where it starts to get gross, so I apologize. So in one 2015 thread, a new poster introduces themselves by writing, "I've read some of the posts around here, and frankly, I'm rather concerned. I think it might be helpful if you got some insight from a woman's mind, as well as a few tips." And the tips here echo the advice shared by members of incel support in the other intro thread that we saw. The idea is like women aren't just after some muscle-bound dude. There are different standards of beauty, so people like different things and are attracted to all kinds, and that the social contexts matter a great deal for how you meet people and how successful it is. Likewise, as with the incel support introductory thread that we saw earlier, the new Loveshy poster is soon made to realize that she too violated this board's norm. So one Loveshy member just responds by saying GTFO, which means get the fuck out. Another one says, I'm not trying to scare you away or anything. You might receive some abuse, but if you take the time to even try to understand what these guys are going through and be respectful, you'll be better received. So again, compare this to incel support. Both boards responded to a new member's norm violations with some kind of reproach. But whereas the incel support members attempted to sort of gently correct the poster and sort of introduce them to the board's norms, the Loveshy members simply rejected the original poster's perspectives, warning that she might receive abuse if she stayed. Whereas incel support then cultivated norms of openness, plurality, and contestation within the community and between its members, Loveshy simply turned away from outsiders and their diverging opinions. And again, this is a clear pattern that you can see from other threads as well. So in this 2010 thread, one member of Loveshy writes that he read a thread on here recently that said there are only 5 or 6 truly misogynistic posters on this board. The rest just vent about women, but don't really hate women. But it's really hard to tell the difference between the ones that do and the ones that don't sometimes by reading their posts, which is like, I don't know, a very nuanced way to think about what's happening on this board. In response to this pretty interesting analysis of the community's norms of discourse, one moderator from Loveshy responds with a critique and advice by saying, I've noticed your writing style has all the hallmarks of the incel forum, meaning incel support. It's backbreakingly polite, and we're the mirror of the incel forum, right? So like, you're doing it wrong. This opposition to incel support is echoed by other Loveshy moderators and administrators in the same thread. So one site administrator points the poster to a different thread titled The Rant About Incel Support, and reflects on the difference between incel support and Loveshy by saying it just goes to show how castrated the male mods over there are, and all for the sake of keeping women there and not getting their precious feelings hurt. Here again, we see the members of Loveshy actively constructing their board's identity in opposition to the more welcoming incel support. They juxtapose Loveshy as a community that deliberately encourages casual, if not aggressive, misogyny. And again, this is evident elsewhere as well. So in a thread dedicated solely to misogynistic fat jokes, one poster again complains by saying, I personally find these pretty offensive. Come on, guys. Before another one responds, so fuck off then. And it then immediately posts another misogynistic and fatphobic joke in order to annoy the feminists and whinging manginas. So again, we can see that the norms of Loveshy operate in the same way, right? Misogyny runs unchecked, it's even encouraged, and the few members that speak up or respond with criticism about these practices are called names, and then the remaining members sort of double down on the misogyny that's being critiqued. So this is true of the members, but it is also reflected and reinforced by the moderation strategies as well. So for the most part, Loveshy moderators generally accepted and in some cases even encouraged misogynistic posts. So in one case up on the slide now, a moderator dismissed one member's violent rhetoric against women by simply replying, he's in one of his phases of severe depression again. This moderation, again, had some critics. One new member wrote in frustration after an introduction thread was derailed by a moderator, fuck it, this is my goodbye. The moderator just pissed me off. When a moderator calls members names, that's one forum I don't want to be part of. Rather than apologizing or explaining his behavior, the moderator simply makes a joke in response. And then another moderator responds by saying, that moderator gave me a hard time when I first came here too. And again invokes incel support by suggesting that the original poster try out the incel forum, which will probably have the positivism, meaning positivity, that you want, but prepared to be coddled. So again, instead of taking seriously the members' complaints and hosting a robust discussion about the tone of the board and the community identity it was creating, Loveshy moderators here seem more likely to simply dictate the board's tone with a kind of take it or leave it attitude. This is a moderation style that I think intentionally worked to create the anti-democratic incel identity that is more familiar to us today. This is actually the sort of anti-feminist authoritarian approach was pretty explicit. The board's guidelines clearly proclaimed that this forum is not a democracy. And moderators really took this to heart, ruling the board according to their own inclinations. So responding to complaints from some board members, one moderator wrote, I would like to clarify a few things. I did encourage Alexius to go buy a gun and kill his crush, but I will neither retract, apologize, or somehow make my opinion more palatable. If you have a problem with that somehow ruining the forums for you, then tough. I'm the owner and I say what I want, whereas at a moment's notice, I can restrict your right to do the same. So by encouraging aggressively misogynistic tone and substance and ignoring or banning members who criticize those choices, the love shy moderation style facilitated the construction of an incel identity that was more aggressive, misogynistic, fatalistic, and anti-democratic than that of incel support. Questions? Okay. So there's a lot more to say, I think, about this transformation of incel from a supportive self-help group to a violently misogynistic hate group. And I've only, again, just begun kind of wading through this archive stuff. I think it's really rich and exciting, and there's a lot there. But ultimately, what I want to emphasize is that by focusing on the role of social norms and moderation practices, I think we can get a kind of more nuanced account of exactly how incel identities were constructed, maintained, and altered, especially in the group's early days. As we've seen, members of incel support, while still focused on their condition of incel, were actively anti-misogynist. For this community, incel was understood to be a temporary personal condition to overcome, not an inherent problem with women or society at large. And while the community encountered misogynistic rhetoric and beliefs, they were quickly identified as inappropriate. And so within this early form, incel was actively constructed as an identity that was equitable, diverse, supportive, feminist, and democratic. And importantly, I think the cultivation of this identity can't be fully explained by the technological affordances of the message boards in question. Both boards operated in a similar manner, with anonymity playing a similar role in both sites. So in both places, incels' real names and offline identities were hidden, including their gender, unless they decided to disclose that themselves. The result is that both sites allowed incels to gather as a social group in the face of stigma. Likewise, both forums faced misogynistic posts from newcomers, but the community's responses to this misogyny and the community identity they created as a result were quite different. As these cases suggest, it was at least in part the differences in the community's social norms and moderation practices that led to different forms of disclosure and discussion. So incel support appeared to have strong democratic norms of inclusion and contestation. New members who we assume unintentionally violated the norms of anti-misogyny were rebuked and redirected to resources that would help socialize them into the board's expectations. Whereas on Love Shy, the board intentionally set itself up as the opposite of incel support. It actively cultivated norms of misogyny, aggression, hostility, and it suggested to norm violators that they did not belong and they would be abused if they stayed. These norms, again, were not just informally enforced by the community members. Board moderators played an important role in setting and reinforcing these democratic or undemocratic norms through both their moderation styles as well as their relationship with board members. So on incel support, moderators were selected to represent the community's diverse membership. Moderation practices were the subject of discussion and critique on open threads, and members openly complained about moderators' approach and discussed alternative strategies for maintaining the board's identity through more formal institutions that were a little bit different. On Love Shy, by contrast, there's no evidence of similar discussions. In fact, when we see evidence of Love Shy moderators not only ignoring the misogyny that appeared on the board, but also encouraging it explicitly, and while members complained about these practices or choices, the complaints were ignored or dismissed, and they were told in no uncertain terms that critique was unwelcome on the board. So then we see Love Shy moderators wielding their considerable power to cultivate the board's identity as anti-feminist, anti-democratic, and sort of authoritarian. It's perhaps unsurprising then that Love Shy cultivated a reputation for being hostile and aggressive or kind of undemocratic, while incel support was known as a supportive, welcoming feminist space, or what we might think of as a more democratic group. So what do we do with all this? These two examples, I think, are obviously incomplete due to a variety of archival losses that, again, I'm happy to talk about. Only a small sample of the board's activity remains available. It's also only the stuff that was publicly available. So if you had to log in to get to the site, to get to posts, like I can't see that. I'm doing this through the Wayback Machine. But I do think that even this scant evidence suggests that there's more to incels than simply anonymous message boards and toxic masculinity. Comparing these two sites, it becomes clear that the norms and moderation practices of the forums are crucial in the cultivation and maintenance of these two differing identities. And so rather than understanding incel as necessarily anti-democratic ideology, one that kind of seduces lonely and isolated men into radical misogyny, I think this history emphasizes just how active and deliberate this identity was constructed by members and moderators of Love Shy, and that they were constructing this specifically to be the opposite of incel support, which was more welcoming and inclusive. And so as we think about how to build digital spaces that foster democratic social groups and identities and users, I think we can think of some lessons from this comparison, or at least some things that we should spend more time thinking about. So the first thing is that I think these cases highlight the nuances of incel identity construction. While both incel support and Love Shy were responding to the stigma associated with their sexual inexperience, they utilized different destigmatizing strategies to do so, to borrow from Michelle Lamont's work. Incel support constructed an identity that was temporary and pluralistic. It accommodated many ways of being incel and encouraged members to embrace the other aspects of their identity as they overcame the condition of incel to reintegrate into the community at large. On Love Shy, by contrast, the authoritarian moderation practices and the norms that they enforced worked to stabilize a single way of being incel, one that came to be known as being red or black pilled, or awakened to the reality of feminism's hold on a static system of sexual hierarchy. So reframing incel's practices of identity construction in terms of destigmatizing strategies and looking at how those differed across the norms and moderation practices of these two communities, I think can help us open new possibilities for addressing anti-democratic incel communities today by thinking again about what are they actually doing in these spaces. Second, I think it highlights the importance of group style. There's been a lot of work and a lot of really good work done explaining the incel worldview, and identifying the key themes in incel ideologies as well as their connection to violence. But I think what this work largely fails to consider is that these ideologies are, again, cultivated in particular and distinctive ways. So while some work like Hoffman and his colleagues trace the connection between incel norms and internet culture, we also know from this group style literature that culture is mediated through different group styles that, as incel support and Love Shy show, can have very different effects on how that culture sort of manifests in behavior. So I think this indicates that there's a little bit more work that has to be done in tracing the processes of transformation from Alana's list to today's incel communities. That's sort of where I see this project going, I think, for myself. But finally, again, the idea behind all of this is that I think attention to the sort of role of stigma and the way that group style plays out can hopefully suggest us some alternative strategies for more broadly addressing these quote unquote bad civil society groups that gather in digital spaces. So if community norms and moderation practices contribute to creating the conditions under which incels were able to construct a more radically anti-democratic group identity on Love Shy, the goal would be that these practices could also help to democratize incel groups today and help to prevent future anti-democratic extremist groups from forming in the first place. At the very least, I think that it requires some more work looking at that possibility. So I will leave it there, but again, I'm happy to hear questions and feedback in whatever time we have left.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Let me just start off by saying how much I personally enjoyed that. This is work that is in some ways, unfortunately, work after my own heart. And I have already learned a bunch for it. I have a million questions that I could ask, but I'm not going to very rudely jump in and impose my privilege here. I'll open the floor to others first. And given that we're a relatively small group, it might make sense, Jennifer, unless you have like additional slides that you think you might want wind up sharing, if we stop screen share, and then anybody can essentially just jump in as they see fit. Any questions from others? Enrique, please.
Hey, I'm Enrique. I am a fellow. So Jennifer, this is super interesting. I wonder if have you given any thought yet to potential people who are members of both boards at the same time, right? So, one of the advantages of anonymity is that I guess I can be, a guilty incel or a needy incel sometimes, or I could be an angry incel some other times, and I have both of these, you talked about a very brief overlap period. I guess that doesn't really, the possibility of that doesn't really mess with your conclusions in any way, because we can all have multiple identities and we're all, but I wonder if if those people did in fact exist, if the way that they participate in each board is being shaped and moderated by the norms and moderations, I guess that would kind of support a lot of what you're saying, right? So it's that actually does kind of shape, so not just someone's interaction with other incels, but their kind of self-concept as an incel, depending on whether or not they're on one board or the other one.
Yeah, this is a great question. I've been thinking, so I've gotten some other feedback about actually talking to some of these members, which I think would be very cool. And I'm not sure logistically how to find them yet. But I think, you know, as the project grows and develops, I think that's certainly a thing that I'm going to have to figure out how to do. And so thinking about the overlap and potential overlap is, I think, really yeah, really interesting. So there is some, you know, I think you saw a little bit of that in some of the posts that I shared. There is some sort of like back and forth in some pages where the members on Love Shy are talking about how they got kicked off of incel support, right? And so there clearly was a point when they were together or like thinking of these in conversation. And so, you know, my inclination would be to say, like, yes, there is at least someone that was doing both of those things. But even if not, or like they're impossible to find because it's been 20 years, I think, you know, it's telling to, this is going to be kind of me rambling, but it's telling to me that, and interesting that Love Shy saw itself as the counter of incel support. And from what I can tell, incel support didn't talk about Love Shy at all, right? And so there's something going on there, I think, that's really interesting. And that the incel and the Love Shy people are just like constantly thinking, using that space to like think about what went wrong with their engagements with incel support. And so yeah, yes, I think the answer is like, yes, there's something there. And I'm going to have to try and figure out how to get at it.
That was actually one of the things that I wanted to ask about. But since you mentioned, right, that you're thinking about, or it's been suggested to you that you might try to do some interviews and you're not quite sure how to logistically go about that. I've had some success in the past with just going to whatever current forums are around and initially introducing myself anonymously as a researcher, and you know, essentially saying, I'm doing this work right on these two forums. If you were ever a participant in them, I would love to talk to you, and essentially say, I want to hear your story, good, bad, and ugly, right? So it's just you're providing an open, like, these folks love to talk about themselves,
Yeah.
and including the worst of the misogynists from someplace like Love Shy. But I wouldn't reveal, right, much about yourself initially. Okay. Like, you can get into a little bit back and forth with them to figure that out, but you don't want to open yourself up in the first instance to some of the like serious threats, you know, that could come from that initial, like, you need a little bit of back and forth to determine how serious they are before you share too much about who you are. But just starting with that general, hey, I want to tell your story. Like, I'm really interested in what was going on in these places, good, bad, and ugly. Yeah, a lot of these folks just want to talk.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. You know, this is my first foray into this like extremist, and you know, yeah, which I know, you know, a whole bunch of people, male supremacy, like, oh, this whole thing is like I have to do more even just to see what people are already doing. But I think it sounds really exciting. And I do know that there are also like reform. So there's like a former member who's now uses the handle Reformed Incel, that wrote, he's just like, he took it upon himself to like be the archivist for this community. And so, right, like just like wrote pages and pages and pages of these like thoughts. And so I was thinking that would also be a potential way in, right? As someone who's like, trying to atone, I guess, for his behavior, but like trying to find the forums today would be, I think, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so as I said, I have a bunch of questions for you. I'm going to start with one on the smaller side. Particularly as you were talking about, and you used, I can't remember the exact phrasing that you used, but the bad civil society, right? I'm wondering how much you are drawing on, how much of your work is in conversation with the literature on dark participation. At this point.
Not very much at all yet. So I will Right now, this project is a 4,000 word article for a special issue that is basically what I presented today. So it's got to be longer than that for the next phase. So like, yes, please tell me more about dark participation.
So off the top of my head, because I'm terrible with names, spaces, titles of anything, I'm not going to be able to give you a list of like articles or scholars or anything.
Just like the main idea.
Term dark participation itself will get you started,
Okay,
and it won't be hard to follow that. I mean, it is basically the idea of it's the term that a lot of people thinking about bad civil society have been using in the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years.
Great. Okay.
And really flows out of concern, sort of interrogating the assumption that came, I think, primarily from political science early on in the notions of democracy. The internet is going to democratize the world. This is a way to get everybody to engage more and participate in civic things and build civil society, and like it can be a force for Putnam's vision, right, for the world. And what we've seen is that it can in fact build a ton of social capital, but a lot of that is really deep and dark, right? So you can actually, it can become a force for indeed getting people to participate and build bridges with one another. But that means the ugly, right? The bad side of it. So dark participation has been that kind of has been a key term in that literature.
That's great.
Okay. One, backing out a little bit, question for you. I'm really intrigued. Like, I think this is the perfect moment to be having a conversation about your work and to be pushing it out there in the world for obvious reasons. Right? Everybody is, the talk of the town is the post-Twitter platforms. What are they going to be? This is a slightly unfair question for you, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What, on the basis of what you're doing so far, and also acknowledging that it's early days, if somebody plopped, right, one of these genius developer designers who thinks they're creating the new thing, what's the core advice that you would give them? Not, necessarily do this, but at least think about X, Y, and Z. If it's not the technological affordances, what do they need to be thinking about as they're developing the platform?
That's a great question. I just wrote a book on technological affordances, so I'm still kind of in the vein that's like, you should start with designing the platform correctly. I think those two go hand in hand. If we're trying to think of like what, man, there's lots of ways to answer this question because Twitter disappearing is just upending everything. I think it depends on, so I think my first response would be, what do we want out of the platform, right? Like if what people I think are realizing right now is that like something like Twitter served like a really particular purpose in the public sphere. And it's like, I feel pretty strongly that Twitter's purpose was not actually to like form communities for people like incels who were trying to find each other, right? Like while subaltern groups sort of use Twitter to amplify messages, I'm not sure that's where you're going to find these kind of support. And so I think, if what you want is to build platforms that do facilitate that kind of closer knit, more collective identity, I do think that the affordances matter a great deal. And I think you need to design spaces that are, that signal to users that they share something in common with one another, that like make them sort of think of themselves in community. So I actually think Reddit is really well designed. And so the question, I think, it becomes not a developer question. It becomes like how do users on these spaces go into the other spaces around them and like try to cultivate this kind of more democratic way of being. And, when I started this project, I originally was really, I was thinking about it more about what's happening on Reddit right now with incels. That was before they wiped all of these people. But I think there is some interesting research, I think, that like Reddit has kind of a moderating effect on lots of extremist groups because they have to fit in with the other subreddits or else they're going to get taken down, right? And so, and because like users on Reddit like find themselves entering into more spaces, right, that like those users then become attached not just to being incels, but being incels on Reddit. And so it kind of has like this kind of moderating effect that I think is like really exciting. I'm not confident in the empirical data there, so I don't want to make too strong of a claim, but I think, you know, that would be, I think my short answer is like, we need to think about ways that like different groups can be able to be in conversation with one another, right? That I actually think, and again, this is not borne out with any data so far, but this would be like my hunch of where this particular project is going to go, is that it was the back and forth between incel support and Love Shy that kind of kept Love Shy in check. And ultimately what ended up happening is that Love Shy, incel support servers crashed and the forum just disappeared from the internet entirely.
Oh.
And they couldn't reconstitute themselves because everybody kind of dispersed. And by the time they got everything back up and running, all of the history had disappeared. They couldn't get any of the archives back. And so they had to start from scratch, and Love Shy was already there and running, right? And so if you were Googling, I'm incel, what do I do? Love Shy was the only thing that you got. And so my sense is that there was this period of time when like, you know, they were going in parallel and there's this kind of contestation within the larger incel community, and then half of it disappeared. And the only thing we have left is this like radically anti-democratic group. And then it splinters as well, right? Like the incel community today is very diverse within that very narrow band. And so I think thinking about the relationship within groups and among groups is, I think, I don't know how that would answer the designer question, but I think that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about these kinds of things.
But that makes perfect intuitive sense, because the boundary pusher is pushing boundaries at the expense of community, right? I mean, if you continue to get kicked off, eventually you're going to get kicked off to a place where it's you and just one other person and a moderator. And that, you know, what help is that in terms of, you know, identity formation or, you know, any of the kind of social payoffs that you get when you interact with people who, you know, you think can understand your problems.
I think that's right. But though I do think like there is, again, this like, I don't want to, like, I'm not super Freudian normally, but there's like something very telling about the fact that like the Love Shy guys really just like couldn't give up on incel support, right? That they're like, even though they were kicked off, like there's some part of them that very clearly wanted to still be connected to that community. And like without that tethering sort of relationship, they like spun out into, you know, no holds barred boundary pushing, just like, you know, I think they weren't pushing outward anymore. They were like pushing inward. And so that was like, it became sort of like, well, who can be the most fatalistic and who can be the most misogynistic and who can be the most sort of like flashily aggressive towards women and things like that. So I think the boundary pushing, you're right, like changed its focus in a really problematic way.
Yeah. One of the things you said a minute ago, when answering my unfair question was that you know, you don't think that Twitter was meant to be or became, right, a place for incels to find community per se, right? So instead they're off on Reddit, these other forums, in 4chan, whatever it might be, organizing there and then using Twitter to amplify. But I do think that there are actually a number of communities that that Twitter did help actually create as communities per se. And of course, the classic example we think of is Black Twitter. You know, there's some amazing scholars who have done work on precisely, right, how community has been built there. And so I wonder if there might be something, essentially what I'm doing is giving you an additional research project, but
I'll take it.
I wonder if there might be something there to understand not just within community differences, but across community differences and how those norms are cultivated across different platform spaces with these very different affordances. Right? Because at least as you were presenting the screenshots, incel support and Love Shy, and certainly as you articulated yourself, like they look in terms of the affordances, they look nearly identical.
Yeah.
And yet the organizing that's happening there is fundamentally different from what we're seeing with also different communities, but on the very same platform, right? On Twitter itself. Or, you know, I think even on Reddit, right, they're really good examples of how these interactions are in any case, right?
Yeah.
I would love to learn more about, right, the ways in which, whether it's norms, whether it's community identity per se, whether there's something else, whether there's a third sort of factor here, because you make a compelling case, and I've long thought that it isn't actually, we're putting too much weight on affordances per se, and norms need to come in. But I wonder if digging into some of these other communities challenges or opens up opportunities to think about what those norms are, what norms means, or if there's an additional concept that we need to be getting at to understand what's happening in different ways there. You know, is it like the playfulness, right, of Black Twitter that makes it fundamentally different? Is there something else to that? I don't know at all. I'm just spitballing.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I'm totally with you. I think my inclination is that this project, which is increasingly feeling like a book project to my chagrin, I think it will be a sort of comparative, like looking at different kinds of marginalized groups and the ways that they sort of democratize or not. And the immediate, you know, other comparison for me would be like LGBT groups, right? That we join in similar spaces. You know, so yes, I have to think about that. That's a great. I have no problem with you suggesting that project. I think it's a good idea. This is like, I'm like literally hesitant to speak with any kind of authority on Black Twitter because I don't have it. I'm eagerly waiting for Meredith Clark's book to come out finally. But I am not sure that even scholars of Black Twitter think of it as a community in the way that the incels that I'm thinking of think of themselves in community, right? And I think it's something different, you know. So like Meredith Clark, Andre Brock, like they tend to use, sometimes they use community, but they also use like networks and like collective, you know, like they're sort of using words that are like loose congregation of people, but not community in a kind of really robust sense that it's used elsewhere. And so I think that can account. So I think some of it is like the structure of that community, it just looks different. Some of that I think is because of the affordances of Twitter and what it is helpful for. But I also think like some of what we see as like communities on Twitter are also like communities that are formed elsewhere that use it, right? So even like being Black in the United States, which is really what Black Twitter is a reflection of, right, is like already a kind of subcategory or subgroup that doesn't, so the two examples that I always use when I talk about this are like Black Twitter is the obvious one, but like academic Twitter or political science Twitter, right? Like these are also groups that are like kind of communities, but not really, but have like a very particular way of speaking to each other. And all of those are like, sort of counter publics that I think we see on Twitter sort of reflected in, which I think feels different to me in ways that I'm not fully sure how to articulate than the kinds of communities of like, I'm a person who is looking to join other people for this reason, and I would like a space to do that in.
I think a piece of it is articulated in the name of incel support itself.
Yeah.
Right. It is about support, and even Love Shy, right, is about support within that community. Although I think there's arguments to be made about, you know, that's what's happening even in a place like Twitter with other marginalized communities. Other marginalized groups finding, right? But what is really interesting is that there's always an awareness of how public that communication is in a place like Twitter that would be very different from a forum like this.
Right. And I think invites different kinds of ways of talking and relating to one another as well, right? Like I'm assuming, though again have no proof yet, that the incels would probably feel like they could disclose more kinds of things because it wasn't public in the way that like on Twitter, you know that you're performing for other people who may or may not be the group that you are directly speaking to. You know, I've also thought about though, I've presented even earlier when the project was going a totally different direction, and people kept totally disparate people kept bringing up like punks in the early 90s, late 80s as also a group of thinking about like, this is a group that is organized in response to a wider society that ultimately ended up sort of radicalizing in certain ways and not in others, and sort of the question of selling out versus not. And so I'm also thinking of like, are there also offline analogies that would get at this kind of like, it's not actually the technology, it's something else that's going on as well.
Enrique, did you have anything else?
Nothing other than a class at 2:00. This has been
Perfect.
terrific.
And this is a good moment to wrap up.
Yeah.
My apologies, Jennifer. We did not know until last minute that there was going to be this job talk interfering with things. We were expecting a number of other colleagues who I think when the room for the job talk started emptying out, they felt guilty, like they needed to stay. So that has had the adverse effect here, but it's meant we've got to have more of a conversation, which I very selfishly appreciate.
I do too. Thank you both. This was really fun.
I'm super grateful that you took the time to present to us. I look forward to chatting with you more and learning more about the work as it develops.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.